Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Major Ben Lowsen. Major Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Major Ben is joining us from United States of America, and we are going to talk about the current conflict which is going on in Middle East. But before that, let me introduce Major Ben Lowsen. Major Ben Lowsen is a former US military. He continues to advise the US military on China affairs, and he was a military attaché in Beijing. He has written in international publications and is considered to be one of the foremost authorities on Chinese affairs. He's an expert in Mandarin also. So, Major Ben, thank you so much for joining the show. And we hope to focus a little bit more on, the Chinese aspect in this Middle East conflict, because we have the privilege of hosting you. So, sir, my first question is that, in this ongoing conflict, in this war between Israel and US and Iran, so is China merely watching or quietly shaping the conflict through back channel support to Iran? And is it a covert participant, or is it emerging as one of the biggest beneficiary without firing a shot? The second part of the question comes from a conversation which I had with Joseph Epstein and a couple of other experts on Central Asia, because they said, that overall China is getting more leverage in some other parts of the world because of this ongoing conflict. So how do you look at this whole scenario, sir?
Well, first of all, sir, thank you for having me on the show. You have certainly overpraised me. That said, let me say that, yes, China is doing what it can in this conflict, and I think you're right to point out that it's not doing everything it can. But I believe the actual major story since Venezuela has been China's lack of ability to shape events, especially militarily, in other parts of the world. It's very much focused on Taiwan. So overall, I think that's sort of the reason behind why it's not publicly doing a lot more. It can't, basically. I think the lesson from this, as we saw, is that China needs more force to shape other events around the world. Ultimately, I believe that's the lesson it will draw from it. So back in '96, when it saw that it really couldn't even shape events in the Taiwan Strait crisis right on its doorstep, it developed the military to do that. And if China's economic progress continues, then I would imagine it would develop more force projection capabilities along the lines of the U.S. However, China's economic progress, I don't think, is guaranteed. So it is doing what it can in the background, more or less. So as far as is it going to be the great sort of beneficiary of the U.S.-Israel war against Iran, there's a few theories about how that could happen. It can gain more purchase in Iran. Iran can become a deeper client of China. It could draw some military lessons from this about how to change the regime, how to change a government, and the value of a decapitation strike or strikes. And I think it will try to apply those to the Taiwan situation, and it kind of goes back to how much ability China has. Overall, though, I mean, it's showing that the U.S. still has a significant amount of capability. So to really benefit China, I think it would have to the war would have to show that the U.S. is powerless. I think that's basically failed, although the Strait of Hormuz might be an issue. So that's one theory of strategic victory for Iran, if it can maintain control over Hormuz. Maybe if it can just survive, maybe that's enough for Iran to claim some form of victory. So that would be the way in which China could emerge the victor. But I think it's definitely not certain that that's going to be the case.
So my second question is, there's a lot of buzz on social media also, though, there are a lot of conspiracy theories which do, create a lot of buzz, and for eyeballs, a lot of sensational stories are, sensational theories are being floated. But there is a lot of buzz about that Iran is probably leveraging China's satellite system. That is how, despite not having the air defense system, so it is able to hit specifically the US bases in Gulf, and it is also hitting some of the strategic kind of installations in Gulf. And so is actually basically Iran is leveraging the China satellite system and possible intelligence inputs also. And does that make China, a silent force multiplier? Because we have seen, again, one of the contexts is that in Operation Sindoor, which happened between India and Pakistan last year, So there were credible reports that China was sharing intelligence with Pakistan, and which helped Pakistan, to kind of launch a counter-offensive, though it was, according to our assessment. So, it was not very successful, and India had decimated their air base, but that's a different debate. But overall, this trend of China sharing the intelligence inputs on satellite system, because it's not based on GPS, it is their own satellite system. And is it overrated? Is it being used?
I don't have a certain answer on that. I think it's certainly possible that China has given Iran full access to BeiDou in order to target U.S. facilities. Clearly, Iran has had some success in doing that with radars. Russia, there's been reporting that Russia has been supporting Iran in a similar way as well. But it's certainly a possibility. I looked on the SIPRI database, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, International Peace Research Institute, and it showed that Iran was doing business with Russia, and we knew that, giving Russia the Shahed drones. And those are the drones that have been, relatively cheap and successful and probably strategically viable for Iran. But how much China is supporting them, I'm not sure, but it's certainly possible. And we know that China is supporting them. It's just a question of the degree.
But if you could elaborate a little bit more about, being an expert on Chinese affairs, because there's a lot of talk about the Chinese satellite system, this Chinese navigation system. So, is it actually basically such a formidable force as it is projected, or is it too hyped or too overrated, as the Chinese air defense systems have been? We'll come to the air defense systems and equipment of China also. But to begin with, what about this satellite system?
As far as I know, it's a pretty simple theory. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but geolocation is not that complicated. I guess the question comes, getting the actual positioning is something that requires increased precision, and I think that's something we've seen well within the scope of Chinese industrial capacity. What I guess the war is in the jamming and the ability to obfuscate or somehow confuse what your opponent is seeing. And so I'm sure that is happening on both sides. It seems to be an area that the U.S. focuses on as well. So I would think that battle is ongoing, and we've seen the results.
So, and what about the Chinese weapons which Iran is using? Like, they had used air defense system, as well, correct me if I'm wrong, it was probably HQ-9, though Russia had offered them as 300, but they preferred to take HQ-9. Pakistan had also used the Chinese air defense system, and they didn't work out. And then there is other weaponry also, and there are also reports, if you could throw some light on that, there are Chinese planes, cargo planes, which are landing with a lot of weapons in Iran. So how do you look at this, sir?
Absolutely. So, as we saw with the Russian S-400, where Russia was trying to export that to various countries, including India, it was a political issue for the U.S., and you could see definite consternation on the part of the U.S. that countries were accepting this for intelligence reasons. And not that the U.S. is ever going to attack India or anything like that, but just the pervasiveness of Russian weapons, because they're very cheap. And I think maybe some of that cheapness has been on display in Ukraine, in Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine, and now again in Iran and in Venezuela, where we see Russian and Chinese supplied equipment, and much of the Chinese equipment is based on the Russian equipment in the first place, where the U.S. has been able to defeat it, essentially. So the implication is it doesn't work that well. It's certainly not against the U.S. It might work in other circumstances, but it's not the top of the line equipment that's going to protect your country. I would say there's a report out by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission just 2 days ago, in fact, on what it calls the axis of autocracy. It's this authoritarian network of mutual support, especially China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, maybe a few others in there, sort of in that orbit. But it's a great report. It really goes into it, and it talks about the mutualism that they've set up. So China is helping Iran to avoid sanctions and to sell its oil. Apparently, China forms 90% of one of its petro markets. And it also provides dual-use items and technology, like I'm sure a lot of the tech in the Shahed and other drones comes from China, and diplomatic support around the world to a certain degree. Although recently with Venezuela and Iran, we've seen that diplomatic support is not terribly valuable or even there. So in return, Iran is providing destabilization throughout the Middle East through its proxy forces and its own efforts, like the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah. So that's what China gets out of it. It's not a great deal, honestly, to just destabilize the region, but it does give you a certain degree of leverage. But they also get diplomatic support from Iran in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS grouping. One of the interesting points of the report was that in the past few months, China has sent 2 ships of rocket fuel, sent them on the way to Iran. It doesn't say that they made it there, but China sent them. So clearly there's some practical military support going on from China to Iran, but China's keeping it very low key, and it's a tough situation for them. So obviously not very successful for Iran. It's a bad message, and says if you want equipment that works in wartime, you should probably stick with the democratic powers.
No, though it's a hypothetical question, it seems to be far-fetched also, but the way sometimes wars have their own course. So once they start, you can decide to start it, but probably it's very difficult when you decide that you are going to end it. So is there a possibility or is there a scenario which, of course, the strategic affair experts must have worked out, that China could actually come out and overtly support Iran in this war? Right now, they are covertly supporting Iran in this war. But is there a possibility? Do you see any this kind of thing happening?
I would say it's limited, but the real possibility would be if Iran really starts winning, and it becomes clear that they're going to have a better deal coming out. They can control the Strait of Hormuz. Their regime survives and is somehow strengthened, and something like that. And then in that case, China, I think, very sort of self-interestedly would come out and start supporting Iran more vociferously and with greater material support. It would really mean being able to ship things into Iran. So, the railway, the land-based rail communications with Iran are not great still. There's Afghanistan, there's India, there's lots of countries that aren't necessarily going to be favorable to that. So it would have to be by sea, and that would really mean inflicting a maritime defeat on the U.S. And so I would say that's very, very unlikely that China would do that. Number one, the U.S. seems to have air superiority, if not supremacy. Iran has not effectively targeted American naval vessels thus far. You'd think they would have if they could have, and they didn't. And more than that, Iran's leaders seem to be dying very quickly. So it seems, at this point at least, that seems very unlikely.
With threats to, we've talked about, everybody knows the crisis which is going on in Straits of Hormuz, and it has affected almost every country. Now, with threat to the Strait of Hormuz and the US-backed, exit of Nicolas Maduro, so Venezuela and Iran, they were two of the key suppliers of oil and basically energy products to China. So now, with this situation, the Strait of Hormuz in crisis, Iran is in war. Venezuela is now out of picture as far as Chinese energy supplies are concerned. So do you see China facing a two-front energy shock, and how serious it is for the long-term security of China and the so-called, economic rise of China? Because China is already facing multiple challenges on the economic front also. There are issues about, though they are coming out, the real estate is in really bad shape. A lot of reports are coming out. There are a lot of factories which are basically shutting down also. So how do you see this panning out, sir?
Well, I think one of the reasons why China is not trying to do more, even if it could do more, is that Trump has given China guarantees, as I understand it, both on Venezuelan oil and quite possibly on Iranian oil. So I think he's been clear that he doesn't want to cut off the supply of petrochemicals or oil to China. And so with that guarantee, China is not going to be feeling as threatened right now, especially not in the short term. And indeed, in the short term, the interests are aligned to keep the energy flowing. Iran needs to sell its oil, and the U.S. doesn't want to get bogged down in a war. And I think Trump's been clear about this. And I think he's hopefully smart enough to avoid that. And so he's going to be looking to end it on some favorable terms to the U.S., and at that point, presumably the crisis is over. So whatever the fact of the crisis is, even if it does drag on, it doesn't look like it's going to drag on right now. So the sense of a crisis maybe isn't quite there. I do think in the mid to long term, what are we seeing in the energy markets? I'm not an energy expert by any stretch, but what we are seeing is that data centers are rising. And so, yes, the consumption of traditional fuel, traditional oil, petrochemicals is increasing. Cars, power plants, especially in China. But that's increasing sort of linearly, whereas the consumption of the data centers is going to be increasing more exponentially. And I think ultimately we're going to have clean and safe nuclear energy. Now, obviously, there was a movement against nuclear energy back in the 60s and 70s, and that really limited the extent to which we leveraged nuclear energy. And I think because of that, the sort of intellectual basis of the movement was not too strong. It was more emotional. And I think that's going to come into play. And we really will be seeing nuclear expanding. It seems very logical to me, although, again, I'm not an expert in that area. But so mid to long term, I think the outlook is pretty good with nuclear and other renewable forms of energy.
So thank you, Major Ben Lowsen, for joining the conversation. Always very sharp, incisive, brilliant analysis, deep insights, very enlightening conversation for especially our viewers in this part of the world. And thank you so much because I know it's a pretty busy schedule for you, and thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule. We'll be back soon with another conversation, and we hope to host Major Ben Lowsen back soon again on the show because it's a very fast and rapidly developing story and very complex story. And experts like Major Lowsen help us to demystify and decode these complex developments. Thank you, Major Lowsen, once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arun Anand.